Sophie was not much given to crying, but she sat in the chair for quite a while staring at a blurred and sliding fire demon, and did not pay much attention to the sounds of Michael getting up, until she found him standing beside her, looking embarrassed and a little exasperated. "You're still here," he said. "Is something the matter?" Sophie sniffed. "I'm old," she began. But it was just as the witch had said, and the fire demon had guessed. Michael said cheerfully, "Well, it comes to us all in time. Would you like some breakfast?" Sophie discovered she was a very hale old woman indeed. After only bread and cheese at lunchtime yesterday, she was ravenous. "Yes," she said, and when Michael went to the closet in the wall, she sprang up and peered over his shoulder to see what there was to eat. "I'm afraid there's only bread and cheese," Michael said rather stiffly. "But there's a whole basket of eggs in there," Sophie said, "and isn't that bacon? What about a hot drink as well? Where's your kettle?" "There isn't one," Michael said. "Howl's the only one who can cook." "I can cook," said Sophie. "Unhook that frying pan and I'll show you." She reached for the large black pan hanging on the closet wall, in spite of Michael trying to prevent her. "You don't understand," Michael said. "It's Calcifer, the fire demon. He won't bend down his head to be cooked on for anyone but Howl." Sophie turned and looked at the fire demon. He flickered back at her wickedly. "I refuse to be exploited," he said. "You mean," Sophie said to Michael, "that you have to do without even a hot drink unless Howl's here?" Michael gave an embarrassed nod. "Then you're the one that's being exploited," said Sophie. "Give that here." She wrenched the pan from Michael's resisting fingers, plonked the bacon into it, popped a handy wooden spoon into the egg basket, and marched with the lot to the fireplace. "Now, Calcifer," she said, "let's have no more nonsense. Bend down your head." "You can't make me," crackled the fire demon. "Oh, yes, I can," Sophie crackled back with the ferocity that had often stopped both her sisters in mid-fight. "If you don't, I shall pour water on you, or I shall pick up the tongs and take away both your logs," she added, as she got herself creakingly onto her knees by the hearth. "There," she whispered, "or I can go back on our bargain, or tell Howl about it, can't I?" "Oh, curses!" Calcifer spat. "Why did you let her in here, Michael?" Sulkily, he bent his blue face forward until all that could be seen of him was a ring of curly green flames dancing on the logs. "Thank you," Sophie said, and slapped the heavy pan onto the green ring to make sure Calcifer did not suddenly rise up again. "I hope your bacon burns," Calcifer said, muffled under the pan. Sophie slapped slices of bacon into the pan. It was good and hot. The bacon sizzled, and she had to wrap her skirt round her hand to hold the handle. The door opened, but she did not notice because of the sizzling. "Don't be silly," she told Calcifer, "and hold still because I want to break in the eggs." "Oh, hello, Howl," Michael said, helplessly. Sophie turned round at that, rather hurriedly. She stared. The tall young fellow in a flamboyant blue and silver suit who had just come in stopped in the act of leaning a guitar in the corner. He brushed the fair hair from his rather curious glass-green eyes and stared back. His long, angular face was perplexed. "Who on earth are you?" said Howl. "Where have I seen you before?" "I'm a total stranger," Sophie lied firmly. After all, Howl had only met her long enough to call her a mouse before, so it was almost true. She ought to have been thanking her stars for the lucky escape she'd had then, she supposed, but in fact, her main thought was, "Good gracious, Wizard Howl is only a child in his 20s, for all his wickedness. It made such a difference to be old, she thought, as she turned the bacon over in the pan, and she would have died rather than let this overdressed boy know she was the girl he had pitied on May Day. Hearts and souls did not enter into it. Howl was not going to know. "She says her name's Sophie," Michael said. "She came last night." "How did she make Calcifer bend down?" said Howl. "She bullied me," Calcifer said in a piteous, muffled voice from under the sizzling pan. "Not many people can do that," Howl said thoughtfully. He propped his guitar in the corner and came over to the hearth. The smell of hyacinths mixed with the smell of bacon as he shoved Sophie firmly aside. "Calcifer doesn't like anyone but me to cook on him," he said, kneeling down and wrapping one trailing sleeve round his hand to hold the pan. "Pass me 2 more slices of bacon and 6 eggs, please. And tell me why you've come here." Sophie stared at the blue jewel hanging from Howl's ear and passed him egg after egg. "Why I came, young man?" she said. It was obvious after what she'd seen at the castle. "I came because I'm your new cleaning lady, of course." "Are you indeed?" Howl said, cracking the eggs one-handed and tossing the shells among the logs, where Calcifer seemed to be eating them with a lot of snarling and gobbling. "Who says you are?" "I do," said Sophie, and she added piously, "I can clean the dirt from this place, even if I can't clean you from your wickedness, young man." "Howl's not wicked," Michael said. "Yes, I am," Howl contradicted him. "You forget just how wicked I'm being at the moment, Michael." He jerked his chin at Sophie. "If you're so anxious to be of use, my good woman, find some knives and forks and clear the bench." There were tall stools under the workbench. Michael was pulling them out to sit on and pushing aside all the things on top of it to make room for some knives and forks he had taken from a drawer in the side of it. Sophie went to help him. She had not expected Howl to welcome her, of course, but he had not even so far agreed to let her stay beyond breakfast. Since Michael did not seem to need help, Sophie shuffled over to her stick and put it slowly and showily in the broom cupboard. When that did not seem to attract Howl's attention, she said, "You can take me on for a month's trial if you like." Wizard Howl said nothing but, "Plates, please, Michael," and stood up, holding the smoking pan. Calcifer sprang up with a roar over a leaf and blazed high in the chimney. Sophie made another attempt to pin the wizard down. "If I'm going to be cleaning here for the next month," she said, "I'd like to know where the rest of the castle is. I can only find this one room and the bathroom." To her surprise, both Michael and the wizard roared with laughter. It was not until they had almost finished breakfast that Sophie discovered what had made them laugh. Howl was not only hard to pin down. He seemed to dislike answering any questions at all. Sophie gave up asking him and asked Michael instead. "Tell her," said Howl. "It will stop her pestering." "There isn't any more of the castle," Michael said, "except what you've seen, and 2 bedrooms upstairs." "What?" Sophie exclaimed. Howl and Michael laughed again. "Howl and Calcifer invented the castle," Michael explained, "and Calcifer keeps it going. The inside of it is really just Howl's old house in Porthaven, which is the only real part." "But Porthaven's miles down near the sea," Sophie said. "I call that too bad. What do you mean by having this great ugly castle rushing about the hills and frightening everyone in Market Chipping to death?" Howl shrugged. "What an outspoken old woman you are. I've reached that stage in my career when I need to impress everyone with my power and wickedness. I can't have the king thinking well of me, and last year I offended someone very powerful, and I need to keep out of their way." It seemed a funny way to avoid someone, but Sophie supposed wizards had different standards from ordinary people, and she shortly discovered that the castle had other peculiarities. They had finished eating, and Michael was piling the plates in the slimy sink beside the bench, when there came a loud, hollow knocking at the door. Calcifer blazed up. "Kingsbury door!" Howl, who was on his way to the bathroom, went to the door instead. There was a square wooden knob above the door set into the lintel, with a dab of paint on each of its 4 sides. At that moment there was a green blob on the side that was at the bottom, but Howl turned the knob round so that it had a red blob downward before he opened the door. Outside stood a personage, wearing a stiff white wig and a wide hat on top of that. He was clothed in scarlet and purple and gold, and he held up a little staff decorated with ribbons like an infant maypole. He bowed. Scents of cloves and orange blossom blew into the room. "His Majesty the King presents his compliments and sends payment for 2,000 pair of 7-league boots," this person said. Behind him, Sophie had glimpses of a coach waiting in a street full of sumptuous houses, covered with painted carvings, and towers and spires and domes beyond that, of a splendour she had barely before imagined. She was sorry it took so little time for the person at the door to hand over a long, silken, chinking purse, and for Howl to take the purse, bow back, and shut the door. Howl turned the square knob back so that the green blob was downward again, and stowed the long purse in his pocket. Sophie saw Michael's eyes follow the purse in an urgent, worried way. Howl went straight to the bathroom then, calling out, "I need hot water in here, Calcifer," and was gone for a long, long time. Sophie could not restrain her curiosity. "Whoever was that at the door?" she asked Michael. "Or do I mean wherever?" "That door gives on Kingsbury," Michael said, "where the king lives. I think that man was the Chancellor's clerk. And," he added worriedly to Calcifer, "I do wish he hadn't given Howl all that money." "Is Howl going to let me stay here?" Sophie asked. "If he is, you'll never pin him down," Michael answered. "He hates being pinned down to anything." Chapter 5, which is far too full of washing. The only thing to do, Sophie decided, was to show Howl that she was an excellent cleaning lady, a real treasure. She tied an old rag round her wispy white hair, she rolled the sleeves up her skinny old arms, and wrapped an old tablecloth from the broom cupboard round her as an apron. It was rather a relief to think there were only 4 rooms to clean instead of a whole castle. She grabbed up a bucket and besom and got to work. "What are you doing?" cried Michael and Calcifer in a horrified chorus. "Cleaning up," Sophie replied firmly. "The place is a disgrace." Calcifer said, "It doesn't need it," and Michael muttered, "Howl will kick you out." But Sophie ignored them both. Dust flew in clouds. In the midst of it, there came another set of thumps at the door. Calcifer blazed up, calling, "Porthaven door!" and gave a great sizzling sneeze which shot purple sparks through the dust clouds. Michael left the workbench and went to the door. Sophie peered through the dust she was raising and saw that this time Michael turned the square knob over the door so that the side with a blue blob of paint on it was downward. Then he opened the door on the street you saw out of the window. A small girl stood there. "Please, Mr. Fisher," she said, "I've come for that spell for me mum." "Safety spell for your dad's boat, wasn't it?" Michael said. "Won't be a moment." He went back to the bench and measured powder from a jar from the shelves into a square of paper. While he was doing it, the little girl peered in at Sophie as curiously as Sophie peered out at her. Michael twisted the paper round the powder and came back, saying, "Tell her to sprinkle it right along the boat. It'll last out and back, even if there's a storm." The girl took the paper and passed over a coin. "Has the sorcerer got a witch working for him too?" she asked. "No," said Michael. "Meaning me?" Sophie called. "Oh, yes, my child. I'm the best and cleanest witch in Ingery." Michael shut the door, looking exasperated. "That will be all round Porthaven now. Howl may not like that." He turned the knob green down again. Sophie cackled to herself, a little quite unrepentant. Probably she had let the besom she was using put ideas into her head, but it might persuade Howl to let her stay if everyone thought she was working for him. It was odd. As a girl, Sophie would have shriveled with embarrassment at the way she was behaving. As an old woman, she didn't mind what she did or said. She found that a great relief. She went noisily over as Michael lifted up a stone in the hearth and hid the little girl's coin under it. "What are you doing?" "Calcifer and I try to keep a store of money," Michael said rather guiltily. "Howl spends every penny we've got if we don't." "Feckless spendthrift," Calcifer crackled. "He'll spend the king's money faster than I burn a log. No sense." Sophie sprinkled water from the sink to lay the dust, which made Calcifer shrink back against the chimney. Then she swept the floor all over again. She swept her way toward the door in order to have a look at the square knob above it. The fourth side, which she had not seen used yet, had a blob of black paint on it. Wondering where that led to, Sophie began briskly sweeping the cobwebs off the beams. Michael moaned and Calcifer sneezed again. Howl came out of the bathroom just then in a waft of steamy perfume. He looked marvellously spruce. Even the silver inlets and embroidery on his suit seemed to have become brighter. He took one look and backed into the bathroom again with a blue and silver sleeve protecting his head. "Stop it, woman," he said. "Leave those poor spiders alone." "These cobwebs are a disgrace," Sophie declared, fetching them down in bundles. "Then get them down and leave the spiders," said Howl. Probably he had a wicked affinity with spiders, Sophie thought. "They'll only make more webs," she said. "And kill flies, which is very useful," said Howl. "Keep that broom still while I cross my own room, please." Sophie leaned on the broom and watched Howl cross the room and pick up his guitar. As he put his hand on the door latch, she said, "If the red blob leads to Kingsbury and the blue blob goes to Porthaven, where does the black blob take you?" "What a nosy old woman you are," said Howl. "That leads to my private bolt hole, and you are not being told where it is." He opened the door onto the wide, moving moorland and the hills. "When will you be back, Howl?" Michael asked, a little despairingly. Howl pretended not to hear. He said to Sophie, "You're not to kill a single spider while I'm away." And the door slammed behind him. Michael looked meaningly at Calcifer and sighed. Calcifer crackled with malicious laughter. Since nobody explained where Howl had gone, Sophie concluded he was off to hunt young girls again, and got down to work with more righteous vigour than ever. She did not dare harm any spiders after what Howl had said, so she banged at the beams with the broom, screaming, "Out, spiders! Out of my way!" Spiders scrambled for their lives every which way, and webs fell in swathes. Then, of course, she had to sweep the floor yet again. After that, she got down on her knees and scrubbed it. "I wish you'd stop," Michael said, sitting on the stairs out of her way. Calcifer, cowering at the back of the grate, muttered, "I wish I'd never made that bargain with you now." Sophie scrubbed on vigorously. "You'll be much happier when it's all nice and clean," she said. "But I'm miserable now," Michael protested. Howl did not come back again until late that night. By that time, Sophie had swept and scrubbed herself into a state when she could hardly move. She was sitting hunched up in the chair, aching all over. Michael took hold of Howl by a trailing sleeve and towed him over to the bathroom, where Sophie could hear him pouring out complaints in a passionate mutter. Phrases like, "terrible old biddy," and "won't listen to a word," were quite easy to hear, even though Calcifer was roaring, "Howl, stop her! She's killing us both!" But all Howl said when Michael let go of him was, "Did you kill any spiders?" "Of course not," Sophie snapped. Her aches made her irritable. "They look at me and run for their lives. What are they? All the girls whose hearts you ate?" Howl laughed. "No, just simple spiders," he said, and went dreamily away upstairs. Michael sighed. He went into the broom cupboard and hunted until he found an old folding bed, a straw mattress, and some rugs, which he put into the arched space under the stairs. "You'd better sleep here tonight," he told Sophie. "Does that mean Howl's going to let me stay?" Sophie asked. "I don't know," Michael said irritably. "Howl never commits himself to anything. I was here 6 months before he seemed to notice I was living here and made me his apprentice. I just thought a bed would be better than the chair." "Then thank you very much," Sophie said gratefully. The bed was indeed more comfortable than a chair, and when Calcifer complained he was hungry in the night, it was an easy matter for Sophie to creak her way out and give him another log. In the days that followed, Sophie cleaned her way remorselessly through the castle. She really enjoyed herself, telling herself she was looking for clues. She washed the window, she cleaned out the oozing sink, and she made Michael clear everything off the workbench and the shelves so that she could scrub them. She had everything out of the cupboards and down from the beams and cleaned those too. The human skull she fancied began to look as long-suffering as Michael. It had been moved so often. Then she tacked an old sheet to the beams nearest the fireplace and forced Calcifer to bend his head down while she swept the chimney. Calcifer hated that. He crackled with mean laughter when Sophie discovered that soot had got all over the room and she had to clean it all again. That was Sophie's trouble. She was remorseless, but she lacked method. But there was this method to her remorselessness. She calculated that she could not clean this thoroughly without sooner or later coming across Howl's hidden hoard of girls' souls, or chewed hearts, or else something that explained Calcifer's contract. Up the chimney, guarded by Calcifer, had struck her as a good hiding place. But there was nothing there but quantities of soot, which Sophie stored in bags in the yard. The yard was high on her list of hiding places. Every time Howl came in, Michael and Calcifer complained loudly about Sophie, but Howl did not seem to attend, nor did he seem to notice the cleanliness, and nor did he notice that the food closet became very well stocked with cakes and jam, and the occasional lettuce. For, as Michael had prophesied, word had gone round Porthaven. People came to the door to look at Sophie. They called her Mrs. Witch in Porthaven and Madam Sorceress in Kingsbury. Word had gone round the capital too. Though the people who came to the Kingsbury door were better dressed than those in Porthaven, no one in either place liked to call on someone so powerful without an excuse. So Sophie was always having to pause in her work to nod and smile and take in a gift, or to get Michael to put up a quick spell for someone. Some of the gifts were nice things, pictures, strings of shells, and useful aprons. Sophie used the aprons daily and hung the shells and pictures round her cubbyhole under the stairs, which soon began to look very homelike indeed. Sophie knew she would miss this when Howl turned her out. She became more and more afraid that he would. She knew he could not go on ignoring her forever. She cleaned the bathroom next, That took her days, because Howl spent so long in it every day before he went out. As soon as he went, leaving it full of steam and scented spells, Sophie moved in. "Now we'll see about that contract," she muttered at the bath, but her main target was of course the shelf of packets, jars and tubes. She took every one of them down on the pretext of scrubbing the shelf, and spent most of a day carefully going through them to see if the ones labelled skin, eyes and hair were in fact pieces of girl. As far as she could tell, they were all just creams and powders and paint. If they once had been girls, then Sophie thought Howl had used the tube 4-decay on them and rotted them down the wash basin too thoroughly to recall, but she hoped they were only cosmetics in the packets. She put the things back on the shelf and scrubbed. That night, as she sat aching in the chair, Calcifer grumbled that he had drained one hot spring dry for her. "Where are the hot springs?" Sophie asked. She was curious about everything these days. "Under the Porthaven marshes, mostly," Calcifer said. "But if you go on like this, I'll have to fetch hot water from the waste. When are you going to stop cleaning and find out how to break my contract?" "In good time," said Sophie. "How can I get the terms out of Howl if he's never in? Is he always away this much?" "Only when he's after a lady," Calcifer said. When the bathroom was clean and gleaming, Sophie scrubbed the stairs and the landing upstairs. Then she moved on into Michael's small front room. Michael, who by this time seemed to be accepting Sophie gloomily as a sort of natural disaster, gave a yell of dismay and pounded upstairs to rescue his most treasured possessions. They were in an old box under his worm-eaten little bed. As he hurried the box protectively away, Sophie glimpsed a blue ribbon and a spun sugar rose in it, on top of what seemed to be letters. "So, Michael has a sweetheart," she said to herself, as she flung the window open. It opened into the street in Porthaven too, and heaved his bedding across the sill to air. Considering how nosy she had lately become, Sophie was rather surprised at herself for not asking Michael who his girl was and how he kept her safe from Howl. She swept such quantities of dust and rubbish from Michael's room that she nearly swamped Calcifer trying to burn it all. "You'll be the death of me. You're as heartless as Howl," Calcifer choked. Only his green hair and a blue piece of his long forehead showed. Michael put his precious box in the drawer of the workbench and locked the drawer. "I wish Howl would listen to us," he said. "Why is this girl taking him so long?" The next day, Sophie tried to start on the backyard, but it was raining in Porthaven that day, driving against the window and pattering in the chimney, making Calcifer hiss with annoyance. The yard was part of the Porthaven house too, so it was pouring out there when Sophie opened the door. She put her apron over her head and rummaged a little, and before she got too wet, she found a bucket of whitewash and a large paintbrush. She took these indoors and set to work on the walls. She found an old step-ladder in the broom cupboard, and she whitewashed the ceiling between the beams too. It rained for the next 2 days in Porthaven, though when Howl opened the door with the knob green blob down and stepped out onto the hill, the weather there was sunny, with big cloud shadows racing over the heather faster than the castle could move. Sophie whitewashed her cubby-hole, the stairs, the landing, and Michael's room. "What's happened in here?" Howl asked, when he came in on the 3rd day. "It seems much lighter." "Sophie," Michael said in a voice of doom. "I should have guessed," Howl said, as he disappeared into the bathroom. "He noticed," Michael whispered to Calcifer. "The girl must be giving in at last." It was still drizzling in Porthaven the next day. Sophie tied on her headcloth, rolled up her sleeves and girded on her apron. She collected her besom, her bucket, and her soap, and as soon as Howl was out of the door, she set off like an elderly avenging angel to clean Howl's bedroom. She had left that until last, for fear of what she would find. She had not even dared peep into it, and that was silly, she thought as she hobbled up the stairs. By now it was clear that Calcifer did all the strong magic in the castle, and Michael did all the hack work, while Howl gadded off catching girls and exploiting the other two, just as Fanny had exploited her. Sophie had never found Howl particularly frightening. Now she felt nothing but contempt. She arrived on the landing and found Howl standing in the doorway of his bedroom. He was leaning lazily on one hand, completely blocking her way. "No, you don't," he said quite pleasantly. "I want it dirty, thank you." Sophie gaped at him. "Where did you come from? I saw you go out." "I meant you to," said Howl. "You'd done your worst with Calcifer and poor Michael. It stood to reason you'd descend on me today. And whatever Calcifer told you, I am a wizard, you know. Didn't you think I could do magic?" This undermined all Sophie's assumptions. She would have died rather than admit it. "Everyone knows you're a wizard, young man," she said severely. "But that doesn't alter the fact that your castle is the dirtiest place I've ever been in." She looked into the room past Howl's dangling blue and silver sleeve. The carpet on the floor was littered like a bird's nest. She glimpsed peeling walls and a shelf full of books, some of them very queer-looking. There was no sign of a pile of gnawed hearts, but those were probably behind or under the huge four-poster bed. Its hangings were grey-white with dust, and they prevented her from seeing what the window looked out onto. Howl swung his sleeve in front of her face. Don't be nosy." "I'm not being nosy," Sophie protested. "That room—" "Yes, you are nosy," said Howl. "You're a dreadfully nosy, horribly bossy, appallingly clean old woman. Control yourself. You're victimizing us all." "But it's a pigsty," said Sophie. "I can't help what I am." "Yes, you can," said Howl, "and I like my room the way it is. You must admit I have a right to live in a pigsty if I want. Now go downstairs and think of something else to do. Please. I hate quarrelling with people." There was nothing Sophie could do but hobble away with her bucket clanking by her side. She was a little shaken, and very surprised that Howl had not thrown her out of the castle on the spot. But since he had not, she thought of the next thing that needed doing at once. She opened the door beside the stairs, found the drizzle had almost stopped, and sallied out into the yard, where she began vigorously sorting through piles of dripping rubbish. There was a metallic clash, and Howl appeared again, stumbling slightly in the middle of the large sheet of rusty iron Sophie had been going to move next. "Not here either," he said. "You are a terror, aren't you? Leave this yard alone. I know just where everything is in it, and I won't be able to find the things I need for my transport spells if you tidy them up." So there was probably a bundle of souls or a box of chewed hearts somewhere out here, Sophie thought. She felt really thwarted. "Tidying up is what I'm here for," she shouted at Howl. "Then you must think of a new meaning for your life," Howl said. For a moment it seemed as if he was going to lose his temper too. His strange pale eyes all but glared at Sophie. But he controlled himself and said, "Now trot along indoors, you overactive old thing, and find something else to play with before I get angry. I hate getting angry." Sophie folded her skinny arms. She did not like being glared at by eyes like glass marbles. "Of course you hate getting angry," she retorted. "You don't like anything unpleasant, do you? You're a slitherer outer. That's what you are. You slither away from anything you don't like." Howl gave a forced sort of smile. "Well now," he said. "Now we both know each other's faults. Now go back into the house. Go on. Back." He advanced on Sophie, waving her toward the door. The sleeve on his waving arm caught the edge of the rusty metal, jerked and tore. "Damnation!" said Howl, holding up the trailing blue and silver ends. "Look what you've made me do." "I can mend it," Sophie said. Howl gave her another glassy look. "There you go again," he said. "How you must love servitude." He took his torn sleeve gently between the fingers of his right hand and pulled it through them. As the blue and silver fabric left his fingers, there was no tear in it at all. "There," he said. "Understand?" Sophie hobbled back indoors, rather chastened. Wizards clearly had no need to work in the ordinary way. Howl had shown her he really was a wizard to be reckoned with. "Why didn't he turn me out?" she said, half to herself and half to Michael. "It beats me," said Michael. "But I think he goes by Calcifer. Most people who come in here either don't notice Calcifer, or they're scared stiff of him." Chapter 6, in which Howl expresses his feelings with green slime. Howl did not go out that day, nor for the next few days. Sophie sat quietly in the chair by the hearth, keeping out of his way and thinking. She saw that, much as Howl deserved it, she had been taking out her feelings on the castle when she was really angry with the Witch at the Waste. And she was a little upset at the thought that she was here on false pretenses. Howl might think Calcifer liked her, but Sophie knew Calcifer had simply seized on the chance to make a bargain with her. Sophie rather thought she'd let Calcifer down. This state of mind did not last. Sophie discovered a pile of Michael's clothes that needed mending. She fetched out thimble, scissors, and thread from her sewing pocket and set to work. By that evening, she was cheerful enough to join in Calcifer's silly little song about saucepans. "Happy in your work?" Howl said sarcastically. "I need more to do," Sophie said. "My old suit needs mending, if you have to feel busy," said Howl. This seemed to mean that Howl was no longer annoyed. Sophie was relieved. She had been almost frightened that morning. It was clear Howl had not yet caught the girl he was after. Sophie listened to Michael asking rather obvious questions about it, and Howl slithering neatly out of answering any of them. "He is a slitherer outer," Sophie murmured to a pair of Michael's socks. "Can't face his own wickedness." She watched Howl being restlessly busy in order to hide his discontent. That was something Sophie understood rather well. At the bench, Howl worked a good deal harder and faster than Michael, putting spells together in an expert but slapdash way. From the look on Michael's face, most of the spells were both unusual and hard to do. But Howl would leave a spell midway and dash up to his bedroom to look after something hidden, and no doubt sinister, going on up there, and then shortly race out into the yard to tinker with a large spell out there. Sophie opened the door a crack, and was rather amazed to see the elegant wizard kneeling in the mud with his long sleeves tied together behind his neck to keep them out of the way, while he carefully heaved a tangle of greasy metal into a special framework of some kind. That spell was for the king. Another overdressed and scented messenger arrived with a letter and a long speech, in which he wondered if Howl could possibly spare time, no doubt valuably employed in other ways, to bend his powerful and ingenious mind to a small problem experienced by his Royal Majesty, to wit, how an army might get its heavy wagons through marsh and rough ground. Howl was wonderfully polite and long-winded in reply. He said no, but the messenger spoke for a further half-hour, at the end of which he and Howl bowed to one another, and Howl agreed to do the spell. "This is a bit ominous," Howl said to Michael when the messenger had gone. "What did Solomon have to get himself lost in the waste for? The king seems to think I'll do instead." "He wasn't as inventive as you, by all accounts," Michael said. "I'm too patient and too polite," Howl said gloomily. "I should have overcharged him even more." Howl was equally patient and polite with customers from Porthaven, but, as Michael anxiously pointed out, the trouble was that Howl did not charge these people enough. This was after Howl had listened for an hour to the reasons why a seaman's wife could not pay him a penny yet, and then promised a sea captain a wind spell for almost nothing. Howl eluded Michael's arguments by giving him a magic lesson. Sophie sewed buttons on Michael's shirts and listened to Howl going through a spell with Michael. "I know I'm slapdash," he was saying, "but there's no need for you to copy me. Always read it right through carefully first. The shape of it should tell you a lot, whether it's self-fulfilling or self-discovering, or simple incantation, or mixed action and speech. When you've decided that, go through again and decide which bits mean what they say and which bits are put as a puzzle. You're getting on to the more powerful kinds now. You'll find every spell of power has at least one deliberate mistake or mystery in it to prevent accidents. You have to spot those. Now take this spell." Listening to Michael's halting replies to Howl's questions, and watching Howl scribble remarks on the paper with a strange, everlasting quill pen, Sophie realized that she could learn a lot too. It dawned on her that if Martha could discover the spell to swap herself and Letty about at Mrs. Fairfax's, then she ought to be able to do the same here. With a bit of luck, there might be no need to rely on Culsifer. When Howl was satisfied that Michael had forgotten all about how much or little he charged people in Porthaven, he took him out into the yard to help with the king's spell. Sophie creaked to her feet and hobbled to the bench. The spell was clear enough, but Howl's scrawled remarks defeated her. "I've never seen such writing," she grumbled to the human skull. "Does he use a pen or a poker?" She sorted eagerly through every scrap of paper on the bench and examined the powders and liquids in the crooked jars. "Yes, let's admit it," she told the skull. "I snoop, and I have my proper reward. I can find out how to cure foul pest and abate whooping cough, raise a wind, and remove hairs from the face. If Martha had found this lot, she'd still be at Mrs. Fairfax's." Howl, it seemed to Sophie, went and examined all the things she had moved when he came in from the yard, but that seemed to be only restlessness. He seemed not to know what to do with himself after that. Sophie heard him roving up and down during the night. He was only an hour in the bathroom the next morning. He seemed not to be able to contain himself, while Michael put on his best plum velvet suit ready to go to the palace in Kingsbury, and the two of them wrapped the bulky spell up in golden paper. The spell must have been surprisingly light for its size. Michael could carry it on his own easily with both his arms wrapped round it. Howl turned the knob over the door, read down for him, and sent him out into the street among the painted houses. "They're expecting it," Howl said. "You should only have to wait most of the morning. Tell them a child could work it. Show them. And when you come back, I'll have a spell of power for you to get to work on. So long." He shut the door and roved round the room again. "My feet itch," he said suddenly. "I'm going for a walk on the hills. Tell Michael the spell I promised him is on the bench. And here's for you to keep busy with." Sophie found a grey and scarlet suit, as fancy as the blue and silver one, dropped into her lap from nowhere. Howl, meanwhile, picked up his guitar from its corner, turned the doorknob green down, and stepped out among the scudding heather above Market Chipping. "His feet itch," grumbled Calcifer. There was a fog down in Porthaven. Calcifer was low among his logs, moving uneasily this way and that to avoid drips in the chimney. "How does he think I feel, stuck in a damp grate like this?" "Then you'll have to give me a hint at least about how to break your contract," Sophie said, shaking out the grey and scarlet suit. "Goodness, you're a fine suit, even if you are a bit worn. Built to pull in the girls, aren't you?" "I have given you a hint," Calcifer fizzed. "Then you'll have to give it me again. I didn't catch it," Sophie said, as she laid the suit down and hobbled to the door. "If I give you a hint and tell you it's a hint, it will be information, and I'm not allowed to give that," Calcifer said. "Where are you going?" "To do something I didn't dare do until they were both out," Sophie said. She twisted the square knob over the door until the black blob pointed downward. Then she opened the door. There was nothing outside. It was neither black, nor grey, nor white. It was not thick or transparent. It did not move. It had no smell and no feel. When Sophie put a very cautious finger out into it, it was neither hot nor cold. It felt of nothing. It seemed utterly and completely nothing. "What is this?" she asked Calcifer. Calcifer was as interested as Sophie. His blue face was leading right out of the grate to see the door. He had forgotten the fog. "I don't know," he whispered. "I only maintain it. All I know is that it's on the side of the castle that no one can walk around. It feels quite far away." "It feels beyond the moon," said Sophie. She shut the door and turned the knob green downward. She hesitated a minute, and then started to hobble to the stairs. "He's locked it," said Calcifer. "He told me to tell you if you tried to snoop again." "Oh," said Sophie. "What has he got up there?" "I've no idea," said Calcifer. "I don't know anything about upstairs. If you only knew how frustrating it is. I can't even really see outside the castle, only enough to see what direction I'm going in." Sophie, feeling equally frustrated, sat down and began mending the grey and scarlet suit. Michael came in quite soon after that. "The king saw me at once," he said. He looked round the room. His eyes went to the empty corner where the guitar usually stood. "Oh, no," he said. "Not the lady friend again. I thought she'd fallen in love with him, and it was all over days ago. What's keeping her?" Calcifer fizzed wickedly. "You got the signs wrong. Heartless Howl is finding this lady rather tough. He decided to leave her alone a few days to see if that would help, that's all." "Bother," said Michael. "That's bound to mean trouble. And here was I hoping Howl was almost sensible again." Sophie banged the suit down on her knees. "Really," she said, "how can you both talk like that about such utter wickedness? At least I suppose I can't blame Calcifer, since he's an evil demon, but you, Michael—" "I don't think I'm evil," Calcifer protested. "But I'm not calm about it, if that's what you think," Michael said. "If you knew the trouble we've had because Howl will keep falling in love like this. We've had lawsuits and suitors with swords and mothers with rolling pins and fathers and uncles with cudgels and aunts. Aunts are terrible. They go for you with hat-pins. But the worst is when the girl herself finds out where Howl lives and turns up at the door crying and miserable. Howl goes out through the back door, and Calcifer and I have to deal with them all." "I hate the unhappy ones," Calcifer said. "They drip on me. I'd rather have them angry." "Now let's get this straight," Sophie said, clenching her fists knobbily in red satin. "What does Howl do to these poor females? I was told he ate their hearts and took their souls away." Michael laughed uncomfortably. "Then you must come from Market Chipping. Howl sent me down there to blacken his name when we first set up the castle. I said that sort of thing. It's what aunts usually say. It's only true in a manner of speaking." "Howl's very fickle," said Calcifer. "He's only interested until the girl falls in love with him. Then he can't be bothered with her." "But he can't rest until he's made her love him," Michael said eagerly. "You can't get any sense out of him until he has. I always look forward to the time when the girl falls for him. Things get better then."
"Until they track him down,"
said Calcifer. "You'd think he'd have the sense to give them a false name," Sophie said scornfully. The scorn was to hide the fact that she was feeling somewhat foolish. "Oh, he always does," Michael said. "He loves giving false names and posing as things. He does it even when he's not courting girls. Haven't you noticed that he's Sorcerer Jenkin in Porthaven and Wizard Pendragon in Kingsbury, as well as Horrible Howl in the castle?" Sophie had not noticed, which made her feel more foolish still, and feeling foolish made her angry. "Well, I still think it's wicked, going round making poor girls unhappy," she said. "It's heartless and pointless."
"He's made that way," said Calcifer.
Michael pulled a three-legged stool up to the fire and sat on it, while Sophie sewed, telling her of Howl's conquests and some of the trouble that had happened afterward. Sophie muttered at the fine suit. She still felt very foolish. "So, you ate hearts, did you, Suit? Why do aunts put things so oddly when they talk about their nieces? Probably fancied you themselves, my good Suit. How would you feel with a raging aunt after you, eh?" As Michael told her the story of the particular aunt he had in mind, it occurred to Sophie that it was probably just as well the rumours of Howl had come to Market Chipping in those words. She could imagine a strong-minded girl like Letty otherwise getting very interested in Howl and ending up very unhappy. Michael had just suggested lunch, and Calcifer, as usual, had groaned, when Howl flung the door open and came in, more discontented than ever. "Something to eat?" said Sophie. "No," said Howl. "Hot water in the bathroom, Calcifer." He stood moodily in the bathroom door a moment. "Sophie, have you tidied the shelf of spells in here by any chance?" Sophie felt more foolish than ever. Nothing would have possessed her to admit that she had gone through all those packets and jars looking for pieces of girl. "I haven't touched a thing," she replied virtuously, as she went to get the frying pan. "I hope you didn't," Michael said uneasily as the bathroom door slammed. Rinsings and gushings came from the bathroom while Sophie fried lunch.
"He's using a lot of hot water,"
Calcifer said from under the pan.
"I think he's tinting his hair. I hope you left the hair spells alone. For a plain man with mud-coloured hair, he's terribly vain about his looks."
"Oh, shut up," snapped Sophie. "I put everything back just where I found it." She was so cross that she emptied the pan of eggs and bacon over Calcifer. Calcifer, of course, ate them with enormous enthusiasm and much flaring and gobbling. Sophie fried more over the spitting flames. She and Michael ate them. They were clearing away, and Calcifer was running his blue tongue round his purple lips, when the bathroom door crashed open and Howl shot out, wailing with despair. "Look at this!" he shouted.
Look at it! What has that one-woman force of chaos done to these spells?"
Sophie and Michael whirled round and looked at Howl. His hair was wet, but apart from that, neither of them could see that it looked any different. "If you mean me," Sophie began. "I do mean you. Look!" Howl shrieked. He sat down with a thump on the three-legged stool and jabbed at his wet head with his finger. "Look! Survey! Inspect! My hair is ruined. I look like a pan of bacon and eggs." Michael and Sophie bent nervously over Howl's head. It seemed the usual flaxen colour right to the roots. The only difference might have been a slight, very slight, trace of red. Sophie found that agreeable. It reminded her a little of the colour her own hair should have been. "I think it's very nice," she said. "Nice!" screamed Howl. "You would. You did it on purpose. You couldn't rest until you made me miserable too. Look at it. It's ginger. I shall have to hide until it's grown out." He spread his arms out passionately. "Despair!" he yelled. "Anguish! Horror!" The room turned dim. Huge, cloudy, human-looking shapes bellied up in all four corners and advanced on Sophie and Michael, howling as they came. The howls began as moaning horror and went up to despairing brays and then up again to screams of pain and terror. Sophie pressed her hands to her ears, but the screams pressed through her hands louder and louder still, more horrible every second. Calcifer shrank hurriedly down in the grate and flickered his way under his lowest log. Michael grabbed Sophie by her elbow and dragged her to the door. He spun the knob to blue down, kicked the door open, and got them both out into the street in Porthaven as fast as he could. The noise was almost as horrible out there. Doors were opening all down the road, and people were running out with their hands over their ears. "Ought we to leave him alone in that state?" Sophie quavered. "Yes," said Michael. "If he thinks it's your fault, then definitely." They hurried through the town, pursued by throbbing screams. Quite a crowd came with them. In spite of the fact that the fog had now become a seeping sea drizzle, everyone made for the harbour or the sands, where the noise seemed easier to bear. The grey vastness of the sea soaked it up a little. Everyone stood in damp huddles, looking out at the misty white horizon and the dripping ropes on the moored ships, while the noise became a gigantic, heartbroken sobbing. Sophie reflected that she was seeing the sea close for the first time in her life. It was a pity that she was not enjoying it more. The sobs died away to vast, miserable sighs, and then to silence. People began cautiously to go back into the town. Some of them came timidly up to Sophie. "Is something wrong with the poor sorcerer, Mrs. Witch?" "He's a little unhappy today," Michael said. "Come on. I think we can risk going back now." As they went along the stone quayside, several sailors called out anxiously from the moored ships, wanting to know if the noise meant storms or bad luck. "Not at all," Sophie called back. "It's all over now." But it was not. They came back to the wizard's house, which was an ordinary, crooked little building from the outside that Sophie would not have recognized if Michael had not been with her. Michael opened the shabby little door rather cautiously. Inside, Howl was still sitting on the stool. He sat in an attitude of utter despair, and he was covered all over in thick green slime. There were horrendous, dramatic, violent quantities of green slime, oodles of it. It covered Howl completely. It draped his head and shoulders in sticky dollops, heaping on his knees and hands, trickling in glops down his legs and dripping off the stool in sticky strands. It was in oozing ponds and crawling pools over most of the floor. Long fingers of it had crept into the hearth, It smelled vile.
"Save me!"
Calcifer cried in a hoarse whisper. He was down to 2 desperately flickering small flames.
"This stuff is going to put me out."
Sophie held up her skirt and marched as near Howl as she could get, which was not very near. "Stop it," she said. "Stop it at once. You are behaving just like a baby." Howl did not move or answer. His face stared from behind the slime, white and tragic and wide-eyed. "What shall we do? Is he dead?" Michael asked, jittering beside the door. Michael was a nice boy, Sophie thought, but a bit helpless in a crisis. "No, of course he isn't," she said. "And if it wasn't for Calcifer, he could behave like a jelly deal all day for all I care. Open the bathroom door." While Michael was working his way between pools of slime to the bathroom, Sophie threw her apron into the hearth to stop more of the stuff getting near Calcifer and snatched up the shovel. She scooped up loads of ash and dumped them in the biggest pools of slime. It hissed violently. The room filled with steam and smelled worse than ever. Sophie furled up her sleeves, bent her back to get a good purchase on the wizard's slimy knees, and pushed Howl, stool and all, toward the bathroom. Her feet slipped and skidded in the slime, but of course the ooziness helped the stool to move too. Michael came and pulled at Howl's slime-draped sleeves. Together they trundled him into the bathroom. There, since Howl still refused to move, they shunted him into the shower stall. "Hot water, Calcifer!" Sophie panted grimly. "Very hot!" It took an hour to wash the slime off Howl. It took Michael another hour to persuade Howl to get off the stool and into dry clothes. Luckily, the grey and scarlet suit Sophie had just mended had been draped over the back of the chair, out of the way of the slime. The blue and silver suit was ruined. Sophie told Michael to put it in the bath to soak. Meanwhile, mumbling and grumbling, she fetched more hot water. She turned the doorknob green down and swept all the slime out onto the moors. The castle left a trail like a snail in the heather, but it was an easy way to get rid of the slime. There were some advantages to living in a moving castle, Sophie thought as she washed the floor. She wondered if Howl's noises had been coming from the castle too, in which case she pitied the folk of market chipping. By this time Sophie was tired and cross. She knew the green slime was Howl's revenge on her, and she was not at all prepared to be sympathetic when Michael finally led Howl forth from the bathroom clothed in grey and scarlet, and sat him tenderly in the chair by the hearth.
"That was plain stupid," Calcifer sputtered. "Were you trying to get rid of the best part of your magic or something?"
Howl took no notice. He just sat, looking tragic and shivering. "I can't get him to speak," Michael whispered miserably. "It's just a tantrum," Sophie said. Martha and Letty were good at having tantrums too. She knew how to deal with those. On the other hand, it is quite a risk to spank a wizard for getting hysterical about his hair. Anyway, Sophie's experience told her that tantrums are seldom about the thing they appear to be about. She made Calcifer move over so that she could balance a pan of milk on the logs. When it was warm, she thrust a mugful into Howl's hands. "Drink it," she said. "Now, what was all this fuss about? Is it this young lady you keep going to see?" Howl sipped the milk dolefully. "Yes," he said. "I left her alone to see if that would make her remember me fondly. And it hasn't. She wasn't sure even when I last saw her. Now she tells me there's another fellow." He sounded so miserable that Sophie felt quite sorry for him. Now his hair was dry, she noticed guiltily it really was almost pink. "She's the most beautiful girl there ever was in these parts," Howl went on mournfully. "I love her so dearly, but she scorns my deep devotion and gets sorry for another fellow. How can she have another fellow after all this attention I've given her?
They usually get rid of the other fellows as soon as I come along."
Sophie's sympathy shrank quite sharply. It occurred to her that if Howl could cover himself with green slime so easily, then he could just as easily turn his hair the proper colour. "Then why don't you feed the girl a love potion and get it over with?" she said.
"Oh, no," said Howl. "That's not playing the game. That would spoil all the fun."
Sophie's sympathy shrank again. A game, was it?
"Don't you ever give a thought for the poor girl?" she snapped.
Howl finished the milk and gazed into the mug with a sentimental smile.
"I think of her all the time," he said. "Lovely, lovely Letty Hatter."
Sophie's sympathy went for good with a sharp bang. A good deal of anxiety took its place. "Oh, Martha," she thought, "you have been busy. So it wasn't anyone in Cesaris you were talking about." Chapter 7, in which a scarecrow prevents Sophie from leaving the castle. Only a particularly bad attack of aches and pains prevented Sophie from setting out for market chipping that evening. But the drizzle in Porthaven had got into her bones. She lay in her cubbyhole and ached and worried about Martha. It might not be so bad, she thought. She only had to tell Martha that the suitor she was not sure about was none other than Wizard Howl. That would scare Martha off. And she would tell Martha that the way to scare Howl off was to announce that she was in love with him, and then perhaps to threaten him with aunts. Sophie was still creaking when she got up next morning. "Curse the Witch of the Waste," she muttered to her stick as she got it out, ready to leave. She could hear Howl singing in the bathroom as if he had never had a tantrum in his life. She tiptoed to the door as fast as she could hobble. Howl, of course, came out of the bathroom before she reached it. Sophie looked at him sourly. He was all spruce and dashing, scented gently with apple blossom. The sunlight from the window dazzled off his grey and scarlet suit and made a faintly pink halo of his hair. "I think my hair looks rather good this colour," he said. "Do you, indeed?" grumped Sophie. "It goes with this suit," said Howl. "You have quite a touch with your needle, don't you? You've given the suit more style somehow." "Huh," said Sophie. Howl stopped with his hand on the knob above the door. "Aches and pains troubling you?" he said. "Or has something annoyed you?" "Annoyed?" said Sophie. "Why should I be annoyed? Someone only filled the castle with rotten aspic, and deafened everyone in Porthaven, and scared Calcifer to a cinder, and broke a few hundred hearts. Why should that annoy me?" Howl laughed. "I apologize," he said, turning the knob to red down. "The king wants to see me today. I shall probably be kicking my heels in the palace until evening, but I can do something for your rheumatism when I get back. Don't forget to tell Michael I left that spell for him on the bench." He smiled sunnily at Sophie and stepped out among the spires of Kingsbury. "And you think that makes it all right?" Sophie growled as the door shut, but the smile had mollified her. "If that smile works on me, then it's no wonder poor Martha doesn't know her own mind," she muttered. "I need another log before you go," Calcifer reminded her. Sophie hobbled to drop another log into the grate. Then she set off to the door again. But here Michael came running downstairs and snatched the remains of a loaf off the bench as he ran to the door. "You don't mind, do you?" he said in an agitated way. "I'll bring a fresh loaf when I come back. I've got something very urgent to see to today, but I'll be back by evening. If the sea captain calls for his wind spell, it's on the end of the bench, clearly labelled." He turned the doorknob green downward and jumped out onto the windy hillside, loaf clutched to his stomach. "See you!" he shouted, as the castle trundled away past him and the door slammed. "Botheration!" said Sophie. "Calcifer,
How does a person open the door when there's no one inside the castle? I'll open it for you, or Michael. Howl does it himself, said Calcifer. So no one would be locked out when Sophie left. She was not at all sure she would be coming back, but she did not intend to tell Calcifer. She gave Michael time to get well on the way to wherever he was going, and set off for the door again. This time Calcifer stopped her. "If you're going to be away long," he said, "you might leave some logs where I can reach them." "Can you pick up logs?" Sophie asked, intrigued in spite of her impatience. For answer, Calcifer stretched out a blue arm-shaped flame divided into green finger-like flames at the end. It was not very long, nor did it look strong. "See? I can almost reach the hearth," he said proudly. Sophie stacked a pile of logs in front of the grate so that Calcifer could at least reach the top one. "You're not to burn them until you've got them in the grate," she warned him, and she set off for the door yet again. This time somebody knocked on it before she got there. It was one of those days, Sophie thought. It must be the sea captain. She put up her hand to turn the knob blue down. "No, it's the castle door," Calcifer said, "but I'm not sure." Then it was Michael back for some reason, Sophie thought as she opened the door. A turnip face leered at her. She smelled mildew. Against the wide blue sky, a ragged arm ending in the stump of a stick wheeled round and tried to paw at her. It was a scarecrow. It was only made of sticks and rags, but it was alive, and it was trying to come in. "Calcifer!" Sophie screamed. "Make the castle go faster!" The stone blocks round the doorway crunched and grated. The green-brown moorland was suddenly rushing past. The scarecrow's stick arm thumped on the door, and then went scraping along the wall of the castle as the castle left it behind. It wheeled its other arm round and seemed to try to clutch at the stonework. It meant to get into the castle if it could. Sophie slammed the door shut. This, she thought, just showed how stupid it was for an eldest child to try to seek her fortune. That was the scarecrow she had propped in the hedge on her way to the castle. She had made jokes to it. Now, as if her jokes had brought it to evil life, it had followed her all the way here and tried to paw at her face. She ran to the window to see if the thing was still trying to get into the castle. Of course, all she could see was a sunny day in Porthaven, with a dozen sails going up a dozen masts beyond the roofs opposite, and a cloud of seagulls circling in the blue sky. "That's the difficulty of being in several places at once," Sophie said to the human skull on the bench. Then, all at once, she discovered the real drawback to being an old woman. Her heart gave a leap and a little stutter, and then seemed to be trying to bang its way out of her chest. It hurt. She shook all over, and her knees trembled. She rather thought she might be dying. It was all she could do to get to the chair by the hearth. She sat there panting, clutching her chest. "Is something the matter?" Calcifer asked. "Yes, my heart. There was a scarecrow at the door," Sophie gasped. "What has a scarecrow to do with your heart?" Calcifer asked. "It was trying to get in here. It gave me a terrible fright, and my heart—" "But you wouldn't understand, you silly young demon," Sophie panted. "You haven't got a heart." "Yes, I have," Calcifer said, as proudly as he had revealed his arm. "Down in the glowing part under the logs, and don't call me young. I'm a good million years older than you are. Can I reduce the speed of the castle now?" "Only if the scarecrow's gone," said Sophie. "Has it?" "I can't tell," said Calcifer. "It's not flesh and blood, you see. I told you, I couldn't really see outside." Sophie got up and dragged herself to the door again, feeling ill.
She opened it slowly and cautiously. Green steepness, rocks and purple slopes whirled past, making her feel dizzy, but she took a grip on the doorframe and leaned out to look along the wall to the moorland they were leaving behind. The scarecrow was about 50 yards to the rear. It was hopping from clump to heather clump with a sinister sort of valiance, holding its fluttering stick arms at an angle to balance it on the hillside. As Sophie watched, the castle left it further behind. It was slow, but it was still following. She shut the door. "It's still there," she said, "hopping after us. Go faster."
"But that upsets all my calculations," Calcifer explained. "I was aiming to circle the hills and get back to where Michael left us in time to pick him up this evening."
"Then go twice as fast, and circle the hills twice, as long as you leave that horrible thing behind," said Sophie.
"What a fuss,"
Calcifer grumbled, but he increased the castle's speed. Sophie could actually, for the first time, feel it rumbling around her as she sat huddled in her chair, wondering if she was dying. She did not want to die yet, before she had talked to Martha. As the day went on, everything in the castle began to jiggle with its speed. Bottles chinked, the skull clattered on the bench. Sophie could hear things falling off the shelf in the bathroom and splashing into the bath where Howl's blue and silver suit was still soaking. She began to feel a little better. She dragged herself to the door again and looked out with her hair flying in the wind. The ground was streaking past underneath. The hills seemed to be spinning slowly as the castle sped across them. The grinding and rumbling nearly deafened her, and smoke was puffing out behind in blasts. But the scarecrow was a tiny black dot on a distant slope by then. Next time she looked, it was out of sight entirely.
"Good! Then I shall stop for the night," said Calcifer. "That was quite a strain."
The rumbling died away. Things stopped jiggling. Calcifer went to sleep in the way fires do, sinking among the logs until they were rosy cylinders plated with white ash, with only a hint of blue and green deep underneath. Sophie felt quite spry again by then. She went and fished 6 packets and a bottle out of the slimy water in the bath. The packets were soaked. She didn't dare leave them that way after yesterday, so she laid them on the floor and very cautiously sprinkled them with the stuff labelled drying power. They were dry almost instantly. This was encouraging. Sophie let the water out of the bath and tried the power on Howl's suit. That dried too. It was still stained green and rather smaller than it had been, but it cheered Sophie up to find she could put at least something right. She felt cheerful enough to busy herself getting supper. She bundled everything on the bench into a heap round the skull at one end and began chopping onions. "At least your eyes don't water, my friend," she told the skull. "Count your blessings." The door sprang open. Sophie nearly cut herself in her fright, thinking it was the scarecrow again, but it was Michael. He burst jubilantly in. He dumped a loaf, a pie, and a pink and white striped box on top of the onions. Then he seized Sophie round her skinny waist and danced her round the room. "It's all right! It's all right!" he shouted joyfully. Sophie hopped and stumbled to keep out of the way of Michael's boots. "Steady! Steady!" she gasped, giddily trying to hold the knife where it would not cut either of them. "What is all right?" "Letty loves me," Michael shouted, dancing her almost into the bathroom and then almost into the hearth. "She's never even seen Howl. It was all a mistake." He spun them both round in the middle of the room. "Will you let me go before this knife cuts one of us?" Sophie squawked, "and perhaps explain a little?" "Whee!" Michael shouted. He whirled Sophie to the chair and dumped her into it, where she sat gasping. "Last night I wished you'd dyed his hair blue," he said. "I don't mind now. When Howl said Letty Hatter, I even thought of dyeing him blue myself. You can see the way he talks. I knew he was going to drop this girl just like all the others as soon as he'd got her to love him, and when I thought it was my Letty, Anyway, you know he said there was another fella, and I thought that was me, so I tore down to Market Chipping today, and it was all right. Howl must be after some other girl with the same name. Letty's never even seen him." "Let's get this straight," Sophie said dizzily. "We are talking about the Letty Hatter who works in Cesare's pastry shop, are we?" "Of course we are," Michael said jubilantly. "I've loved her ever since she started work there, and I almost couldn't believe it when she said she loved me. She has hundreds of admirers. I wouldn't have been surprised if Howl was one of them. I'm so relieved. I got your cake from Cesare's to celebrate. Where did I put it? Ah, here it is." He thrust the pink and white box at Sophie. Onion fell off it into her lap. "How old are you, my child?" Sophie asked. 15 last May Day," said Michael. "Calcifer sent fireworks up from the castle, didn't you, Calcifer? Oh, he's asleep. You're probably thinking I'm too young to be engaged. I've still got 3 years of my apprenticeship to run, and Letty's got even longer. But we promised one another, and we don't mind waiting." Then Michael was about the right age for Martha, Sophie thought, and she knew by now he was a nice steady lad with a career as a wizard ahead of him. Bless Martha's heart. When she thought back to that bewildering May Day, she realized that Michael had been one of that shouting group leaning on the counter in front of Martha. But Howl had been outside in Market Square.